A world-famous actress walks into a prison under a different name, carrying nothing but books and an idea. What if stories could change lives? Among the inmates, she meets Jennifer, a woman who refuses to speak but writes with the force of a storm. Page by page, Jennifer's words reveal a past the system tried to erase, a truth too raw to ignore. When Emma secretly sends her manuscript to a publisher, the world outside takes notice, and suddenly, the prisoner nobody believed in becomes the voice everyone is talking about. But can a book really rewrite a life? And what happens when the system realizes it's losing control of its own narrative? Stay with us to find out how this story ends. And don't forget to subscribe. The rain came in sheets, smudging the neon glow of the city beyond the thick, reinforced glass of the taxi. The driver didn't speak, nor did Emma expect him to. The further they drove from the heart of London, the more the world seemed to fold into itself. Gray buildings giving way to barbed fences, and cobbled streets dissolving into the cracked, uneven pavement leading to a place where time moved differently. She had been in grand halls before, on sets where entire worlds were constructed from wood and paint, but this was no illusion. The prison stood before her, a monolith of stone and steel, indifferent to the passing of years or the stories of those it held inside. She stepped out of the cab, the wind biting through her coat. No cameras followed her here, no eager fans clutching books with trembling hands. For the first time in years, she was no one. The guard at the entrance barely looked at her as she signed in under the name she had chosen for this version of herself. Emily Harper. It was a borrowed identity, a fragile shield against the weight of expectation. If they knew who she was, they would listen differently. Admiration could be a wall just as much as disdain. She needed them to see her as she was, not as the character they thought they knew. Inside, the air carried the weight of too many closed doors. The scent of bleach and damp concrete clung to the walls, mingling with something more elusive, something human, but muted. Footsteps echoed in the corridors, the rhythm sharp and deliberate. Emma followed the warden through hallways lined with heavy doors, each one a boundary between lives that no longer belonged to those who lived them. She had read about the women here, the ones whose names never made headlines. Some were here for mistakes made in a moment, others for choices that had been made for them long before they ever had the power to resist. And then there were the ones like Jennifer. The classroom was small, windowless. A circle of chairs had been arranged, their plastic surfaces worn smooth by restless hands. Emma set her bag down carefully, as though the weight of the books inside might shatter the fragile truce of silence that hung in the air. They filed in slowly, some with the dull-eyed detachment of routine, others with quiet curiosity. She met their gazes without expectation. Some glanced at her, then away. A few carried the hardness of women who had long since learned that kindness often had a cost. Jennifer was the last to enter. She was tall, her frame lean in the way of someone who had never been given the luxury of softness. Her hair was cut short, not out of preference but necessity. There was a stillness in her posture that reminded Emma of unlit matches, potential held too tightly, waiting for a spark. She took the seat farthest from Emma, arms crossed, her gaze a shield that dared anyone to breach it. The first meeting was never about literature. It was about space, who took it, who yielded. Emma spoke little, letting the silence settle between them like ink soaking into paper. The room breathed with its own rhythm. A woman with a name tag reading Monroe flipped through a book without reading it, her fingers skimming the edges of the pages as if testing their sharpness. Another, older, sat with her arms folded, her expression unreadable. Jennifer said nothing. Emma began with stories, ones that had survived centuries, passed from hands that had written them in ink, in blood, in whispers. She spoke of women whose words had outlived them, of voices that had once been drowned out but now sang through history. She told them about Charlotte Perkins Gilman, whose yellow wallpaper had peeled away the walls of silence, about Maya Angelou, who had caged her own pain in poetry until it learned to fly. Some listened, some didn't. Jennifer watched her, her expression unmoved, but her fingers tapped against her knee, a restless, barely perceptible rhythm. The first session ended without ceremony. The women stood, some lingering as if debating whether they had lost or gained something in the exchange. Jennifer left without looking back. The guards escorted them away, the door shutting with a finality that sent a ripple through the air. Emma sat alone for a moment, tracing the worn edges of the book she had brought. It was an old edition of Jane Eyre, the spine creased from years of being held too tightly. She didn't expect change to come easily. Stories were bridges, but they could not be built overnight. Days passed, and each session was a thread woven into something unseen. Some women spoke more, their words hesitant, as if testing the weight of their own voices. Others remained silent, but their presence in the room was its own kind of conversation. Jennifer still said nothing. One evening, long after the session had ended, Emma found a slip of paper tucked into her book. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. What happens to the women who never make it out of the attic? No name, no explanation, but Emma knew who had written it. She smiled, just slightly. The match had been struck. The paper was thin, the ink slightly smudged. Emma turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of the question written in deliberate, sharp strokes. It lingered in her mind long after she had left the prison, long after the gates had closed behind her with their usual finality. What happens to the women who never make it out of the attic? A reference to Jane Eyre, of course, but also something more. A voice reaching out, testing the space between them. The match had been struck, but whether it would burn or smolder into nothing remained uncertain. The next session arrived with a quiet hum of expectation. The women filed in as before, some more at ease now, others still guarded. The room had begun to take on a shape of its own, the edges softening, though the walls still stood firm. Emma watched them settle, watched the way they claimed their space. Monroe flipping absently through the pages of a book she never read. The older woman, Sandra, Emma had learned, sitting with her arms crossed but her gaze steady, and Jennifer, always last, always distant, but present. Emma placed a book in the center of the circle. It was worn, the pages yellowed at the edges. The yellow wallpaper. Some of them knew the title, others didn't. It didn't matter. The story was a quiet rebellion, a whisper that had turned into a storm over time. She told them about the woman in the story, about the creeping vines of confinement and the way a mind, pressed too tightly into a space too small, would begin to press back. Jennifer didn't move, but her eyes, dark and unreadable, held something coiled beneath the surface. It was Monroe who spoke first. She wasn't crazy, she said. The words were flat, but there was something behind them, something edged. They just didn't like that she saw the walls for what they were. A ripple, a shift. The silence afterward was not the silence of disinterest, but of thought. They read in pieces, passing the book between them, words filtering into the air, settling into the cracks of the room. Some read hesitantly, some with the fluency of women who had spent years escaping into stories, and some refused to speak at all, letting the words sink into them without giving any back. Jennifer did not take the book, but she did not leave either. The session ended. The chairs scraped against the floor, the guards waiting by the door. The women dispersed, some slower than others, some holding the weight of the story in their steps. Jennifer walked past Emma without a glance, but as she did, something small, barely noticeable, fell from her fingers and landed on the table between them. A slip of paper. Emma didn't open it until later, alone in her apartment, the world outside softened by the rain against the windows. What if she was right to tear it down? Not a question of literature, a question of survival. Emma pressed the paper between the pages of the book, marking a place she would return to. Days passed and the next session came. This time the room was different. The women entered with something unspoken between them, something that had carried over from the last session. Emma had seen this before, the way stories lingered, how they seeped into the bones of those who read them. The discussion was slower this time, more careful. Sandra spoke of silence, of how a woman's voice could be taken from her long before she ever stepped into a prison. Monroe talked about walls, not the ones made of concrete, but the invisible ones, the ones that trapped a person even when they were standing in the open air. Jennifer still did not speak. But she wrote. The next note was folded smaller, slipped between the pages of the book Emma had left behind. If you were locked in a room with nothing but words, would they be enough? Emma did not answer with paper. Instead, she brought in a blank notebook and placed it on Jennifer's chair before the session began. No name.
No explanation.
Jennifer arrived late, as always. She saw the notebook but did not pick it up. The session continued, the discussion weaving its way through the space between them. And then, just before the guards came to take them back, Jennifer reached for it. Emma didn't acknowledge it, but she saw the way Jennifer's fingers curled around the edges, the way she held it as though testing its weight. That night there was no note. A week passed, then another. Jennifer did not return the notebook, but when she walked into the next session, she did something she had not done before. She met Emma's gaze, and in her hands a new notebook. Not empty. Emma didn't ask. She didn't have to. Some stories were told in words, others in the spaces between them. The notebook sat between them like an unspoken challenge. Jennifer placed it on the table, its cover worn at the edges. The pages inside filled with something Emma had not yet seen but could already feel pressing against the air between them. There was no ceremony, no declaration, just an object given shape by the weight of whatever had been poured into it. Emma didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she let the moment settle, let Jennifer sit back in her chair, arms crossed, gaze distant but steady. The room moved around them, the other women arriving, Monroe with her usual restless energy, Sandra with her silent observance, the others with their own measured steps. The rhythm of the sessions had begun to take on a life of its own. Small rituals forming in the spaces between words, in the way some women now arrived early, in the way they lingered after the hour had ended, reluctant to return to the version of life that waited beyond these walls. Jennifer, despite her silence, was a gravitational force. The others noticed the notebook, the shift in her stance. It was subtle, but in a place like this, where power existed in the smallest of gestures, it was enough. Emma let the session move forward as if nothing had changed. The topic today was Toni Morrison, words that carried the weight of history, of loss, of survival. They read passages aloud, some stumbling over the language, others letting the sentences roll over them like waves. Sandra spoke of memory, of the way the past never really let go. Monroe talked about ghosts, about how some things never stopped haunting. Jennifer said nothing, but her fingers tapped against the table, a rhythm Emma had come to recognize, a restlessness, a readiness. When the session ended, the women rose from their seats, the guards waiting by the door. Jennifer was the last to stand. The notebook remained between them, untouched. Then, as if it were an afterthought, she exhaled and pushed it forward. Not looking at Emma, not waiting for a response. And then she was gone. Emma didn't open it immediately. She carried it with her, the weight of it unfamiliar in her hands. Outside the prison walls, the city moved at a different pace. Fast, unyielding. She could hear the murmur of traffic, the hum of conversations she wasn't part of. The world had no idea what sat in her hands, the significance of it. To anyone else, it was just a book filled with ink. She waited until she was home, until the quiet of her apartment wrapped around her like a familiar presence. She turned on a single lamp, the soft light casting shadows against the walls. And then she opened the first page. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, the same as the notes Jennifer had left before. The sentences were short, the words cutting clean across the paper. I don't know how to start. A pause, then another line beneath it. So I'll start with what I remember. And then the story unfolded. It was not polished. It was not careful. It was raw, jagged at the edges, a narrative that did not follow the rules but had its own kind of rhythm, its own undeniable pull. It was not a confession, nor was it an excuse. It was simply what was left of a life that had not been given the luxury of being rewritten. Emma read, the hours slipping by unnoticed. Jennifer's story was one of fire and steel. It was about a girl who had learned too soon that the world did not wait for the weak, that survival was a currency that demanded payment in ways no one ever warned you about. It was about a mother who had been there and then wasn't, about a father who existed in the form of distant memories and the smell of cheap liquor. It was about nights spent in borrowed spaces, about the kind of hunger that didn't just gnaw at your stomach but at the edges of your mind. And then it was about a choice, a moment that had changed everything. The details were not written plainly, but Emma knew how to read between the lines. A job gone wrong. A plan that had not been hers but had belonged to someone older. Someone who had already learned how to make pawns out of people who had nothing left to lose. A moment where the balance had tipped, where Jennifer had been given a gun and a decision to make. She had not pulled the trigger, but someone else had. And in the end, the system did not care about details. Jennifer had been 17 when the sentence had come down, when the courtroom had swallowed her whole, when the world had decided what she would become. Emma closed the notebook, the weight of it pressing against her hands. She had read stories like this before, but never like this. Never from someone who had written it not as a plea, not as a performance, but as a truth laid bare, with all its sharp edges left intact. Jennifer had given her this, not as a gift, as a test. The next session came. The women gathered, their usual places claimed without words. The air felt different, though most wouldn't have noticed. Jennifer entered last, as she always did. She sat, arms crossed, waiting. Emma met her gaze, and slid the notebook back across the table. No words, just that. Jennifer hesitated. Then, slowly, she picked it up, flipping to where she had left off. The session moved forward, the women speaking, the discussion shifting from Morrison to the nature of power, to the way stories shaped the people who carried them. And then, for the first time, Jennifer spoke. Her voice was even measured, not hesitant, not searching. Some stories don't have endings. A statement, a truth. And in that moment, the match that had been struck began to burn. The walls of the prison held sound in strange ways. The thick concrete absorbed voices, dulling them into something less than whispers, but certain things carried. Laughter when it was rare, the sharpness of an argument, the way silence sometimes felt heavier than noise. Emma had come to recognize the way the air changed before a moment of revelation, the way tension settled like an invisible presence in the room. Jennifer's voice had been the shift. Some stories don't have endings. The words had settled over the room, drawing the attention of the other women like an invisible thread being pulled taut. Monroe had stilled, the usual restless tapping of her fingers against the chair stopping mid-motion. Sandra, who never reacted quickly to anything, had raised an eyebrow slightly, the closest thing to surprise she ever allowed herself. The others had turned, their gazes sharp but cautious, the way people looked at an animal that had been quiet for too long. Jennifer had spoken, and now she could not take it back. She did not say anything else that day, but something had shifted. Emma felt it as the sessions continued. The notebooks that had been left untouched on the table for weeks were now picked up, if only for a moment. Words were being tested, turned over in minds that had long since learned to keep things locked away. Some of the women began writing, though few admitted it outright. Monroe, always the loudest, had started marking up the pages of a book with half-written thoughts, scribbled phrases in the margins that seemed like they wanted to be something more. Sandra, despite her usual reluctance, had asked if she could borrow a novel to read in her cell, though she had made it clear she wasn't looking for anything sentimental. And Jennifer, without a word, had begun filling pages. She no longer handed them over as she had the first time. Emma did not ask and Jennifer did not offer. But when she sat in the circle, there was a new energy beneath her silence. Her posture had changed, not relaxed, but less rigid, the edges of her wariness beginning to soften. She still listened more than she spoke, but now, when someone said something that struck a nerve, her fingers would tighten around the edge of her notebook, her knuckles whitening slightly. Emma noticed. She said nothing. It wasn't about rushing the process. Some things could not be forced open. They had to be left to unfold on their own, like pages turning in a book at just the right moment. Then came the night when Jennifer left something behind. It was not a full notebook this time, just a single sheet, folded carefully and placed where Emma would find it. The paper was lined, torn from the pages she had been writing in. The handwriting was the same, sharp, deliberate, as though each word had been carved rather than written. If you let the walls tell your story, they will always make you the villain. Emma read the sentence more times than she could count. It was not a confession. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact. She thought about it as she walked home that night, her steps slow, measured. The city outside the prison moved as it always did, indifferent to the small revolutions taking place behind locked doors. The rain had come again, misting against the glow of streetlights, pooling in the cracks of the pavement. Emma moved through it unnoticed, blending into the quiet hum of a world that did not know the weight of what had been left in her hands. She did not respond with a note this time. Instead, she brought something else. At the next session, she arrived early, setting the books down in their usual places. She had chosen carefully stories of survival, of women who had rewritten their own endings despite the way the world had tried to shape them. She placed Beloved on the table, The Color Purple, The House on Mango Street, and then, next to Jennifer's seat, she placed The Bell Jar. The others arrived. Monroe made some comment about the number of books, flipping through them as though weighing their worth in her hands. Sandra picked up Beloved, running her fingers over the cover before nodding slightly, as if approving of its presence. Jennifer walked in last. She saw the book. She did not pick it up immediately. She sat, arms crossed, posture unreadable. The session began, the discussion moving through the room, a current pulling in different directions. Some women spoke, some listened, and Jennifer at some point reached for the book. She turned it over, studying the cover. Then, slowly, she opened it. It was a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone else. But to Emma, it was everything. The notebook she had given Jennifer weeks ago had been the first step. This was the second. The fire had caught, and soon it would begin to spread. The first time Jennifer stayed after the session, she did not acknowledge that she had done so. The other women rose from their chairs, their movements slow, reluctant in the way that came when something had settled inside them and they weren't yet ready to step away from it. The guards waited by the door, the routine as strict as ever. But Jennifer remained in her seat, the book Emma had given her resting on her lap, the edges of its pages folded slightly where her fingers had gripped too tightly. Emma didn't speak. She only waited, letting the moments stretch between them, letting Jennifer decide if there was something she wanted to say. The silence in the emptying room was different from before. It wasn't the silence of resistance. It was something closer to thought, to consideration. Jennifer ran her thumb along the spine of the bell jar. The book had not left her hands since she had picked it up. It was the first time Emma had seen her treat an object with something close to reverence. In this place, where everything was temporary, where belongings were scarce and worn down by the weight of too many hands, books had the potential to be something else entirely. Not just pages and ink. Not just stories. Doors. The moment passed. Jennifer stood, tucking the book under her arm, and walked out without looking back. Emma watched her go, knowing that this too was progress. The next time they met, Jennifer had written again. This time, it was not a single sentence on a torn piece of paper. It was pages, 3, maybe 4, folded neatly and left inside the book before it was returned. Emma found them later, sitting alone in her apartment, the city beyond her window alive with sounds that did not belong to her. She unfolded them carefully, smoothing out the creases with her fingertips, as though the words might slip away if she wasn't careful. The handwriting was sharper this time, more confident, but still carrying that same deliberate precision, as if each letter had been placed with purpose. I don't know why I keep writing this down. Maybe because I never got to tell it the way I remember it. Or maybe because I don't want it to only exist in my head anymore. People talk about the moment things change, like it happens all at once. Like a door slamming shut. Like the crack of a gunshot. But most of the time it happens slowly. You don't notice until it's already too late. Until you look around and realize the world you used to live in isn't there anymore. That you've already stepped into another one, and there's no way back. I used to think I'd get out of it, That if I kept my head down, if I was smart enough, careful enough, I wouldn't end up like the others. That I wouldn't be just another girl who got swallowed up. But you don't get to make that choice when the world has already made it for you. They tell you to be grateful, that there are worse things, that at least you're alive, as if that's the only thing that matters. But survival is not the same thing as living. Emma exhaled, staring down at the words, letting them settle into her like embers catching on dry wood. This was not just a story. It was a reckoning. The sessions continued, and something new began to take shape. The air in the room had changed. The other women noticed, though none of them spoke about it directly. Sandra watched Jennifer differently now, not with the cold skepticism she once had, but with something closer to interest. Monroe, always the first to challenge, had started pushing back less, listening more. The balance had shifted. The weight of the room no longer sat solely on Emma's shoulders. Jennifer had stepped into the space, whether she realized it or not. She still did not speak often, but when she did, the room listened. The women who had once barely acknowledged her now glanced in her direction when conversations turned, waiting to see if she would respond. And sometimes she did. One afternoon, Emma arrived early, as she often did. She liked the quiet before the room filled, the few moments where the space felt like hers alone. But this time, she was not alone. Jennifer was already there. She sat at the table, her posture relaxed in a way that was unfamiliar, her notebook open in front of her. The pen in her hand tapped absently against the paper, but when Emma entered, she did not startle. She only looked up briefly, then back down as if she had been expecting her. Emma took her seat without a word. Jennifer did not speak, but she did something else. She turned the notebook, pushing it forward, leaving it open. The pages were filled, words spilling over the lines, entire paragraphs stretching across the margins where the space had not been enough. Emma took in the sight of it, the way the ink had pressed deep into the paper, as though the force of the writing itself had been something physical. She did not reach for it. Not yet. Jennifer exhaled, leaning back in her chair, arms crossed as though bracing for something. This was trust. Not given freely, not given easily, but given nonetheless. Emma picked up the notebook, and for the first time, Jennifer did not look away. And that, more than anything, was the moment the fire began to spread. The notebook was no longer just a collection of pages. It was something alive, pulsing with the weight of what had been written inside. Emma felt it in the way Jennifer's words pressed against the margins, in the indentation of the ink, in the sharp edges of sentences that did not ask for permission to exist. It was no longer a test. It was an offering. Emma read the words in silence, feeling the world outside her apartment fade into something distant, unimportant. The city hummed beyond the windows, traffic moving in its endless, indifferent current. But inside, there was only the weight of the story unfolding beneath her fingertips. Jennifer had not written a confession. It was not an apology, nor was it a justification. It was a reckoning with something deeper, something that had never been given space before. I used to think there was no difference between being seen and being watched, that it all meant the same thing, that it all ended the same way. When you grow up in places like mine, you learn early that people only look at you when they're deciding what you're worth to them, what you can give, what they can take. No one looks at you just to see you. I stopped waiting for that a long time ago, but I don't know what to do with this, with being read, with being understood. It makes me feel like maybe I wasn't supposed to disappear. Emma closed the notebook, pressing her hands against the cover, as though she could still feel the words vibrating beneath the surface. The fire had caught. It was burning now, spreading in the way all great truths did, unstoppable once released into the open. Jennifer did not ask for feedback. She did not seek approval. The next time they met, she only waited. The room around them was the same. Women gathering, conversations weaving through the air, guards stationed at the doors like always. But something had changed. Emma slid the notebook back across the table. Jennifer did not open it. She only nodded, and that was enough. The days continued, and the writing did not stop. It moved beyond Jennifer, beyond the careful exchange of notebooks and silent understanding. Other women began to write, their words hesitant at first, then bolder. Some scribbled on scraps of paper, others in the margins of books. Monroe, who had once scoffed at the idea of literature meaning anything in a place like this, now held a pen like it was something more than just an object. Sandra had started reading aloud, her voice steady, carrying across the room in ways it never had before. The shift was undeniable. Emma had seen it before in different forms. The way words could loosen something that had been buried too deep to reach by any other means. But this time it was different. This time it was not just about expression. It was about survival. Jennifer's pages multiplied. She wrote not in linear order, not in structured paragraphs meant to fit inside some pre-approved format. She wrote like someone trying to put the pieces of herself back together in a way that made sense. She wrote the way people spoke when they forgot to be afraid of their own voices. And then, one day, she handed it to Emma without hesitation. A complete manuscript. Emma took it, feeling the weight of it settle in her hands, heavier than anything she had carried before. Outside the prison walls, the world continued. Inside, something had cracked open. Jennifer's story did not stay within these walls. Emma sent it out anonymously at first. A friend of a friend, a publisher who knew how to listen before speaking. There was no expectation, no promise that anything would come of it. But the fire had already begun to spread, and fire did not ask for permission to consume. The response was immediate. The words Jennifer had once written in the quiet of her cell, believing they would never be seen beyond the concrete and steel, now sat in the hands of people who could not turn away from them. The manuscript became something else. A conversation, a question that demanded an answer, and then a book. Jennifer's name, her real name, on the cover. She did not believe it at first. Even when the letters arrived, even when the news spread through the prison like whispered electricity, even when people who had never looked at her before now watched her with something other than indifference. She did not believe it until the day Emma walked into the session, carrying the first printed copy in her hands. Jennifer took it, fingers running over the embossed title, the weight of it unfamiliar. She did not speak, but the silence around her was different now. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of something beginning. The world outside took notice. The system did not know what to do with a woman who had rewritten the narrative they had given her. It had never planned for that. And yet, there she was. The fire had reached beyond the prison walls. It had touched people who had never set foot inside, people who had never known what it meant to be locked away and forgotten. But they knew a story when they saw one. They knew a voice when it demanded to be heard. Jennifer's sentence was reconsidered. Not because the system suddenly believed in redemption, but because the world was watching now. And the world was listening. When she walked out of the prison gates, it was not the same world she had entered years ago. It was not a free world, not in the way people like to pretend it was. But it was a world where her words existed. A world where she had been given something that could not be taken away. Emma was waiting for her. A book in her hands, an understanding in her eyes. The fire did not stop burning. It never would. Because some stories don't have endings. They only change shape. And then they begin again,